All right, let's start out with a little review. It's been a while since we've been together in Luke. We've been studying the last hours of Jesus' life leading up to his crucifixion. We've talked about the trials that he went through, both the Jewish trial, the religious trial put on by the Jewish leaders, and also the Roman civil trial that he went through. And we saw that the result of these trials, that he was found to be innocent, but at the same time he was sentenced to death. Well, then we talked about the crucifixion. We saw that Jesus was led away to be crucified after this verdict. A man named Simon from Cyrene, which is in modern-day Libya, he was in town for the Passover festival. The Roman guards drafted him into service and made him carry Jesus' cross. Jesus was crucified at 9 a.m., which was the time of the morning sacrifice. And we talked about how the cross was an excruciating death. It was favored by the Romans for this reason, because it created maximum pain and maximum shame. Crosses were placed so that the victim's head was probably about 8 feet off the ground, and we get this from the passage where they took a hyssop branch and handed a sponge up to Jesus to drink, which puts us about 8-9 feet off the ground. And the thing about that is, so often in the artwork we see that he's 20 or 30 feet in the air in this huge cross, but really it was much lower. So with the person on the cross at that level, that meant the crowd that was going by also got the full sensory experience, right? They got all the sights and the sounds and the smells that were going on related to that crucifixion. And in some cases it could go on for days. We saw there were two criminals who were crucified alongside Jesus. They mocked him, calling on him to save himself and them. But then one of the criminals was touched by the Holy Spirit, and he cried out to Jesus for salvation. And Jesus made him the wonderful promise that that criminal would be with him that very day in paradise. Well, after 3 hours on the cross, it was about noon. The Bible tells us that a great darkness came upon the whole land. And the Greek word for darkness suggests that it was a spiritual darkness in addition to the physical darkness. And we noted that this darkness did not represent the absence of God, but rather his active presence. He was pouring out his judgment, his vengeance, his fury. And the righteous Son took that upon himself. He took that judgment that we as sinners were due. Well, after 3 more hours, about 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice and committed his spirit to the Father. The curtain in the temple that separated the Holy of Holies was torn in two from top to bottom. So by his death, Jesus made a way for all to directly access the Father. His blood opened the curtain for sinners to enter. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus made a request of Pilate for the body of Jesus, and they took the body of Jesus down from the cross and wrapped it in cloths. They applied some spices to the wrappings, and they placed the body in Joseph's own unused grave in the side of a hill. Now, all this was done quickly because the end of the day was drawing near, and it would be the beginning of the Sabbath, and this work needed to be completed before the Sabbath. Well, at the same time, there were women that were present, and the women noticed the place where Jesus was laid by Joseph and Nicodemus. And again, the task needed to be completed because of the urgency of the Sabbath about to begin. Tonight, we're going to take a look at the resurrection. So let's read that, and I'll read that in Luke 24. We'll read the first 12 verses, and as always, if you just make note of any important words or phrases, we'll jot them down as we begin our look at this passage. All right, Luke 24, verse 1. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices they had prepared. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, 2 men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And as they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground, the men said to them, Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise. And they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter rose and ran to the tombs, stooping and looking in. He saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Okay. So what are some important words in those verses? Remember.
Rise, risen.
Risen, yeah.
The men at the tomb.
And then the women.
There's an idle tale but marveling.
Idle tale. What was the last part?
Marveling.
Okay, great. That's a good beginning overview for us. Well, it's interesting that this resurrection, this key point in our faith, really doesn't have a lot of details, right? It doesn't really talk a lot about what actually happened. We don't hear about how the body rose or if there were lights, or we don't hear a lot of that. But the gospel writers talk about an empty tomb. They talk about angels explaining the events to women. They talk about disbelieving disciples. And it's just kind of interesting that for as important an event as this is, that maybe there aren't more details. But that's the way the Lord had it in mind for us. Each of the gospels gives a little different picture. We can't harmonize these and bring them all together. But for tonight's purposes, we're going to focus mainly on what Luke has said in these verses in front of us. Well, Luke clearly states in the first verse that these events occurred on the first day of the week. So Sunday morning, this is all happening. For the Jews, as we recall, the day begins at sunset. Jesus was laid in the grave late Friday afternoon, which is day one. He remains there on the Sabbath day, day two, and then he rose from the grave early on Sunday morning, day three. So in the Jewish mindset, being somewhere for part of a day was referred to as being there for the day. So that's where we get this idea that he rose on the third day, even though it wasn't 3 24-hour periods. In the Jewish mindset, it was 3 days. Now, this is important because it relates to what Jesus said in Matthew. Somebody has Matthew 12, 38 through 40. Does somebody have that? Matthew 12, 38 to 40?
Matthew 12.
Oh. Okay, that's okay.
Okay, so the sign of John. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered him, saying, Teacher, we wish to see a sign from you. But he answered them, An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of prophet Jonah. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the head of the earth.
So when they asked Jesus for a sign, he said the only sign you'll have is the sign of Jonah, where Jonah was in the fish for 3 days, and Jesus said that he was going to fulfill that. The Son of Man was going to be in the heart of the earth for 3 days. So we see him here fulfilling that promise. We've spoken about how Jesus is in control of the timing in these final hours before his crucifixion. And we said how the Pharisees really wanted to delay arresting him until after the Passover, when the crowds had gone home. But Jesus, being the ultimate Passover lamb, wanted to make sure that he would be sacrificed on the Passover. So we see clearly the connection between the Feast of Passover and the crucifixion, but we want to see some additional connection here that exists between some other Old Testament feasts and the events that followed the crucifixion. So we had this chart up earlier in our study. I wanted to bring it back again as kind of a reminder. The Jewish year, as God laid it out to Moses, began at the top there in Nisan, and the month began with the new moon. And so by the time of Passover, which was on the 14th of that month, we've got the full moon. And if you recall, we said that the Passover was 1 day, and then immediately after that was the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that ran for the next 7 days. But because these things were right next to each other, they often became referred to as the Passover. And so people would just say the Passover, and often meant the full 8-day period, which technically was the Passover plus the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then after that is the first fruits. We're going to talk about the first fruits tonight. That occurs within that period of time. And then later, 50 days later, the Feast of Weeks or Pentecost, and we'll see how that relates in here too. And then other feasts around the calendar. So we're mainly looking at those initial ones up top, beginning with the Passover. So let's take a look at God's initial instruction to Moses about these feasts. They're listed sequentially for us. So first of all, they're in Leviticus, and I think Alex has these, and if you want to follow along, you can. We're going to be in Leviticus 23. And so if you would go ahead and read 23 verses 4 through 8, this talks about the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, the holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at the time appointed for them. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. But you shall present a food offering to the Lord for 7 days. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work.
Okay, so the 1 day of Passover, followed by the 7 days of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the purpose of this feast was for the Jews. Not only were they baking unleavened bread, but they were removing all of the leaven from their households. So it was this idea of cleansing, or coming out of sin and taking in God's righteousness. It also points to the work of Christ. So just as Jesus died as the Passover lamb, he also fulfilled the Feast of Unleavened Bread by being buried. So that unleavened bread festival relates to his burial and that getting rid of the sin. So he put sin to death, and we are commanded to do the same. This passage speaks of us having a holy walk, and we are to have as we rid the leaven from our lives daily on an ongoing basis. There's not just this one festival during the year, but there's this ongoing. And a little longer passage, Colossians 3:1 through 10, describes that.
If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things that are on earth. For you For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is in your life, appears, then you will also appear with him in glory. Put to death, therefore, what is earthly in you, sexual immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. On account of these, the wrath of God is coming. In these you too once walked, when you were living in them. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, seeing that you have put off the old self with its practices, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge after the image of its creator.
Paul reminds the Colossians that they are to put off these things, that they are to get the leaven out of their lives, just as Jesus did, and hearkening back to the call of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. Also, we are buried with Jesus. So this is symbolized through our baptism. Paul wrote about this in Romans 6, 3 and 4. Somebody
Do
has...
you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus are baptized into his death? We are buried, therefore, with him by baptism into death, in order that, just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life.
So we are buried like Christ, and we'll be raised like him as well. What a tremendous promise that we have there. Well, the next feast listed in the Leviticus passage is the Feast of the First Fruits. And let's pick that up, Alex, verses 9 to 14.
And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel, and say to them, When you come onto the land that I give you, and reap its harvest, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, and he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord, so that you may be accepted. On the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. And on the day when you wave the sheaf, you shall offer a male lamb, a year old, without blemish, as a burnt offering to the Lord. And the grain offering with it shall be 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, a food offering to the Lord with a pleasing aroma. And the drink offering with it shall be of wine, 1/4 of a hin. And you shall eat neither bread nor grain, parched or fresh, until the same day, until you have brought the offerings of your God. It is a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings.
So this feast was occurring during that week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's a little different from some of the other feasts in that, if you recall, the other feasts followed that calendar. God said this will be on this day of this month, and this day of this month. But in this case, he specifies the day of the week. He says, this is going to be on Sunday. This is going to be on the first day of the week, the day after the Sabbath that is within that week of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that kind of sets it apart. And then the Pentecost, Feast of Weeks, is tied to this Feast of First Fruits. It's 50 days after that. So these two feasts, the First Fruits and the Pentecost, are related. In fact, today, the Jews would see the First Fruits as the beginning of this Shavuot or Pentecost period, ending at Pentecost, and they kind of see that as one big period. So this Feast of Weeks is talked about also in Leviticus. Let's hit that real quickly. That's verses 15 and 16, because these two are tied together.
You shall count 7 full weeks from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering. You shall count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath. Then you shall present a grain offering of new grain to the Lord.
So again, it's tied, the timing of it is tied to this first fruits. Now, a little disclaimer here, there's been some disagreement over time about the timing of it. So as we read that passage in Leviticus, it says that the first fruits are to be after the Sabbath that is during that week of unleavened bread. And over time, some of the rabbis, some of the scribes came to say, well, really, we think it means it's after the Sabbath, and the Passover itself is a Sabbath day, so it's tied into that. So there's been some back and forth about that, but it seems to me as I read that originally that it was to be the Sabbath that's during that week, and we're going to come around to that in a minute, and I'll show you why I'm kind of making a big deal out of that. But now they're celebrating it on the 16th of Nisan, so they pegged it to a specific date rather than a day of the week, and I'll pull this together in a minute here. So originally, this Feast of First Fruits was to remind the Israelites that God brought them into a fertile land, the Promised Land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and then as time went on, they were to remember God's provision for them. So these crops came forth. This early crop was like a barley harvest, and they really hadn't done anything to earn it. It just kind of sprang up, and they went out and they grabbed those first fruits, the best fruits, and they brought them in to the temple, and they were waved before the Lord as an offering. So a symbol of the first and the best being offered to God. Well, then we see that Jesus actually is the fulfillment not only of the Feast of Passover and of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but he's also the fulfillment of his first fruits. So he is the first one resurrected. And guess what? If they're first fruits, that kind of implies what? Second fruits and third fruits. There's going to be more fruit. And that's the good news for us. What a great thing. Jesus is those first fruits. Let's read Matthew 27, 52 and 53. This will talk about some other fruits that came along.
The tombs were open, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many.
Interesting little tidbit that Matthew throws in there. Just imagine that. I've often said, if I were writing that gospel, I would have made a big deal out of that, right? I would have written another chapter about that. But he mentioned the passing and moves on. Well,
It's the only place it's mentioned, isn't it?
yeah, it's the only place it's mentioned, right? Yeah, and it just gets kind of passing.
Surprising.
It is, but obviously they were seen by many people and must have had an impact on many people. To hear somebody coming back from the dead, yeah. But for tonight, the point is that here are some more fruits, right? Jesus is the first fruit, and here are some additional fruits. Paul tells us that there are more fruits to come. Somebody has 1 Corinthians 15, 22 to 24.
Everyone dies because all of us are related to Adam, the first man. But all who are related to Christ, the other man, will be given new life. But there is an order to this resurrection. Christ was raised first. Then when Christ comes back, all his people will be raised. After that, the end will come, when he will turn the kingdom over to God the Father, having put down all enemies of every kind.
Here again, Paul talks about this idea. There was a first fruit in Jesus, and there's more fruit to come. Paul also talks about the idea of the dead in Christ will rise first, and then we will join to meet them in the air. So there's this idea of layers or of additional fruit. And this additional fruit is us. We're a part of that. You know, this is the glorious news of Jesus' resurrection. The entire church is going to be raised. Beginning on the day of Pentecost, we see that, the Feast of Weeks. That could be maybe likened to more of a summer harvest, right? There's additional people there. And then throughout time now, we've seen more of a fall harvest. There's more and more people that are being saved and are being a part of this harvest and will be raised in the end time. Well, before we go on, I want to kind of circle back and bring one point home that we touched on a little bit, and I think by putting up a weekly calendar, maybe it can help you visualize the point I'm trying to get to here. Passover was on the 14th day of the month of Nisan. And since these calendars are following a lunar calendar, that means the 14th of the month is going to be on a different day of the week every year because it's following a lunar calendar. We have a little bit of that effect even in our calendar. December 25th is on a different day of the week each year. Well, in the same way the lunar calendar does that, maybe even to a greater extent. So the month begins with a new moon. Passover occurs at the time of the full moon, and it was immediately followed by the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So let's say, for example, if Passover occurred on a Monday, it would look something like this. Passover is on Monday. The Feast of Unleavened Bread begins on Tuesday and runs to the following Monday. Okay? So based on what we just read about the Feast of First Fruits, when would the Feast of First Fruits be? It'd be that following Sunday, right? Because it said the Feast of First Fruits will be on the day after the Sabbath, during that week of unleavened bread. So we would expect then that the Feast of First Fruits would take place on Sunday. Well, that's fine, but in that case, that's what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, almost 7 days after Passover. Okay? Well, the year when Jesus was crucified as the Passover lamb, Passover fell on a Friday. The Feast of Unleavened Bread began on Saturday and ran through the following Friday. So in this case, when is the Feast of First Fruits? Again, it's a Sunday. Okay? But now in this case, the Feast of First Fruits is the third day after the Passover. So because it happened in this specific year, at this specific time, Jesus can say he's fulfilling the sign of Jonah, the third day. He's fulfilling his prophecy that he would rise on the third day. And so it could only happen in that year when the Passover falls on a Friday. If it didn't fall on a Friday, that would shift when that Feast of First Fruits was happening. So again, God's in control of all of this timing, and this is just one more layer that points this out to us and just cries out of God's sovereignty in all of this dealing. Well, verse 1 goes on to say that they went to the tomb taking spices. And who's the they? Well, the they really was started for us back in the previous chapter. The they is the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee. And they saw the place where Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus placed the body in the tomb. The burial had been done in haste, as we said, because of the Sabbath, which was about to start. And some commentators point out that the process of applying spices may have been repeated for several days, just for the aromatics to have their full effect and the antiseptic effect of the compounds to minimize some of the smell that was going on. Well, these women had observed the Sabbath, and now they wanted to give greater attention to the placing of spices and the wrapping of the body. We read later on in verse 10 that Luke mentions them, some of them by name. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James. And then he says there were other women present. So that's who the they is in all of this. He also makes the interesting comment that they had followed him since Galilee. And you'll remember in our study, we talked about, it's been a while ago that we talked about Jesus in Galilee, and then we followed him through Judea and making that way down to Jericho and then into Jerusalem. So they've been with him for quite a while, and it may even be a reference to his beginning of his ministry in Galilee. So maybe these women have been with him for years now. Well, Mark tells us that the women were asking each other who would roll the stone away from the tomb. So they had been there, they had seen the stone put in front of the tomb, and it was common practice with these tombs that were in the side of a hill, there would be an opening, and then they would roll a stone in front of it just to keep out any of the the critters that might want to come in and start nibbling on the dead bodies. So that was common practice. There was often kind of a slot there in front of the opening into the tomb. So the stone was rolled there, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to get that stone rolled away. Matthew tells us that the details that actually it was sealed. There was a seal put around it. And this might have been some seals put at the top of the stone with ropes across it. This was something that the Pharisees convinced Pilate he should do because of the rumors that somebody might take the body. They were afraid that some of the disciples might go in and take the body. So we do know that the tomb was sealed in that way to prevent anybody getting access to it. Well, then we see that when the women arrive at the tomb, they find the stone has been rolled away. So all their worry about what to do was solved for them. The stone had been rolled away. And all four of the Gospels make this point that the stone was rolled away. Matthew adds a detail: there was an earthquake, and an angel rolled the stone away. The angel, with an appearance like lightning, struck fear into the guards. Now here we note that the stone was not rolled away in order to release Jesus from the tomb. He didn't need the stone rolled away in order to get out of the tomb. The stone was rolled away so that the witnesses could get into the tomb and could look and see that it was empty. And in verse 3, we see that's exactly what the women did. They went in. We see in verse 4 that the women are perplexed, they're confused, and they didn't know what to make of what their eyes saw. As they were trying to make some sense out of the scene in front of them, they saw two men standing by them in dazzling apparel. These are angels. They're heavenly messengers, and they're sent to give a message to these women to help them understand what's going on. So the angel's presence caused the women to be afraid and bow their faces to the ground. This is a common response we see in the visitation of angels. There's fear, and people bow down and tremble. So now the women have gone from being confused and perplexed to being terrified. So the angels put forth a question rather than a statement. They asked the women, "Why do you seek the living among the dead?" And actually, this is kind of a gentle rebuke, isn't it? Like they should have known this. Their memories have failed them. Jesus had spoken many times that he will be raised from the dead. We're going to hit just a few of those. Matthew 16:21.
From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised.
And then Matthew 17:22 and 23.
And they were gathering in Galilee. Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were greatly distressed.
And then finally Luke 9:22.
Saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised."
Well, then in verse 6, the angels deliver this great news. He is not here, but he has risen. The Greek uses a passive voice here, so we might read this, "He has been raised." Might be another way of interpreting this passage here. Well, who raised him? God raised him. We see that in Acts 13:30.
But God raised him from the dead.
Romans 8:11.
If the spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead dwells in you, he who raised Christ Jesus from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies through his spirit who dwells in you.
We'll see the Trinity at work here, right? In Acts, Luke says God raised him from the dead. Paul says the Spirit raised him from the dead. Jesus is there. So great Trinitarian picture here in this resurrection. And these words of victory became the earliest creed of the church. He is risen. Well, then we see the angels tell the women in verse 7 they are to remember. The women were to remember what Jesus had said to them while he was still in Galilee. This points back to the earliest days of Jesus' ministry. He had been telling them for 3 years about the things that were to come, but they had to be told to remember these things. What were they remember? What were they to remember? The angels give a basic summary of the gospel here. The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified. This is a reference to the Jewish council and the Romans who carried out the execution. It was a mandatory part of God's plan that Jesus endured the cross. The angel said the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men. It was part of the whole plan. It was a requirement. The trauma that Jesus endured in his final hours was not optional. Not only did Jesus die on our behalf, but he suffered one of the cruelest deaths ever devised on our behalf. They were to remember that Jesus said he would rise on the third day. The third day, that very day they were there talking with the angels. Jesus would fulfill the sign of Jonah and also become the first fruits of many. Verse 8 has some encouraging words for us. When the angel said these words, the women did remember. They recalled the words Jesus had spoken to them, and they returned to the other disciples and told them all he had witnessed. Charles Spurgeon said, "We have a leaky memory that lets much run through." Isn't that a great way to think of it? We have a leaky memory. We can so easily forget the great truths of God. For this reason, we need to refresh ourselves with this good news of Jesus every day. We need to remind one another of it every day. We need to remind ourselves of the glorious news that he is not here but has risen. We often use the expression that we need to preach the gospel to ourselves each day, and this is so true. We need to be reminded each day that Jesus died and rose again. So let me put a question out there for a little discussion and sharing. What's something you have to remember or be reminded of in your walk of faith?
Everything. I feel like every day, it's not a good day if I haven't reminded myself that I'm a sinner and need of grace, or that if I do this on my own power, it's going to be ruined, or I'll get the glory. Boy, it's a good day when I can remind myself even the Bible is true. Just thinking, like going through the calendar thing, but that was God's plan. The timing of all of that, the timing of the festivals, the timing of Jesus. You know, these are books written like 1,000 years apart, more than that. And who would have thought that far back ahead? You know, just to think like what was delivered to Moses and fulfilled. Like the Bible is true. How else are you going to explain that kind of thing? Mere coincidence, or whoever wrote the New Testament? If it wasn't the apostles, they just calculated. They bothered with that level of detail. Just the Bible's true. That's a thing I need to remind myself. I do remind myself of every day. There are some days where you just forget.
I think it's definitely a daily thing for me, just to depend completely on God.
Yeah.
Because I need to. I don't think I have it without him. I know I don't, so dependence and just every day being refreshed. Because we forget, and when we have to go over things, and it reminds us. Like Revelation 5, that's incredible. I keep reading that about the title deed of the earth being given to Jesus. I mean, that's incredible thinking about. We're going to be there. And I read that almost every day now. So, I mean, it's just incredible things. Leviticus 23 was one of my very favorite passages in the Bible. Because when I found that out, I think it was 24 years ago when I read that, and the fulfillments, I just was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible.
Yeah.
That and Revelation 5, I think, is just
Yeah.
Well, there's all the other things too.
We can read that gentle rebuke the angels give to the women and think, oh yeah, they should have known better. But boy, we're in the same boat, aren't we? We need to be reminded too.
Yeah, every day.
Yeah.
When I was driving here tonight, I had the radio on, there was a radio preacher talking there. I had things going through my mind, and he referred to a scripture, 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 3, I think. There's a paraphrase where His divine power gives us everything we need for life and godliness, something to that effect, you know. And I've read that lots of times, and it's just something I needed to be reminded of, because I forget so many things. And then we were here, and it was prayer time. Pastor Yuri referred to that as prayer, I noticed. That was just another reminder of the same thing.
One of my favorite passages, I say that a lot, I know that about a lot of passages, but that one's a favorite too.
Yeah.
What else is outside of providing everything pertaining to life and godliness? What is there other stuff you need or?
Okay, well, let's move along. In verse 9, we see that the women leave the empty tomb and they return to report what has happened, what they've seen, to the 11 disciples. Of course, by this time, Judas is gone, so the 11 are left. Now, we read that they scattered after the arrest and trial of Jesus, but now it seemed that they've reassembled. Somehow they've come back together again. At least by the first day of the week this has happened. So the women, it says, also told the news to the rest beyond the 11. So there were more than just the 11 that were there. We would assume from what we're going to read next week that there are a couple of other disciples that are, one of whom is named next week, traveling to Emmaus. We assume that they were there too. And there may have been more. When we read in Acts chapter 1, so it's Acts 1, verse 15. Let's read that real quickly.
During this time, on a day when about 120 believers or brothers were present, Peter stood up and addressed them.
So maybe some of these 120 are there too, but we know that it's more than just the 11 that the women come back and give the report to. Well, Luke does make the effort to call out some of these women by name. Now, women were generally excluded from giving testimony in the Jewish legal system. They were not considered reliable witnesses. So, and these women were particularly of low esteem in the eyes of Jewish society. Mary Magdalene was the woman who had 7 demons removed from her. Joanna, we believe, is the wife of Chuza, who was Herod's steward. Let's review that. Luke 8, 2 and 3. Someone has those verses.
And also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities. Mary, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had got out, and Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's household manager, and Susanna, and many others who provided for them out of their means.
And then also mentioned here by Luke is Mary, the mother of James. So if you were going to select witnesses, number one, you wouldn't select women, and number two, you wouldn't select these women to be your witnesses to testify to this story. Luke has named a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them though here. Maybe he has in mind the idea of needing 2 or 3 witnesses to confirm a matter. We don't know. But there are other women here as well. They remain unnamed. John was the only disciple recorded to be at the cross. Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus buried the body, but they didn't see the empty tomb. So these women have witnessed everything, right? They've witnessed the death, they've witnessed the burial, and now they're the first to witness the empty tomb. They've been elevated by the resurrected Jesus to be the first to receive the good news. And in their case, it came from the angels. They witnessed the entire sequence. The disciples heard the testimony of the women, but it sounded to them as nonsense. So these men, they're skeptics. They don't believe yet. They think the women are hysterical in this tale that they're telling them. Maybe the grief got to the women, right? So they're discounting the story the women are telling them. So the disciples' first response to the resurrection is not a resounding cry of victory or vindication. They're skeptics. They don't believe. Well, having women as first witnesses and having unbelieving disciples actually speaks to the veracity of the resurrection. Who in the ancient world would fabricate a story and have it based on the testimony of women? No one would concoct such a plot. And how could disciples have fabricated the resurrection, as the Pharisees later accused them, when they weren't even expecting such a thing? And then when they were told about it, they didn't believe it. They wouldn't believe until Jesus personally appeared to them. Well, Luke wraps up this account of the resurrection morning with a footnote about Peter. Peter heard the report of the women and he ran to the tomb. He wanted to see for himself. It's not clear whether he believed the women or not. He may not have. He just wanted to go and see for himself what was going on. And it says he got out there, he stooped over, and he looked into the tomb, and all he sees is linen cloths lying on the slab. The presence of the linen cloths is evidence against the idea that there were some grave robbers who took the body, or that the disciples tried to take it. If that had been the case, they wouldn't have taken the time to unravel the linen cloths and lay them there in the tomb. So Peter leaves the tomb and he returns home. It says he marveled at what he just witnessed. Luke doesn't really make it clear whether Peter believed at this point or not. You can bring your own judgment to that. But Peter soon would believe, and he's going to have a personal encounter with the risen Jesus, and that's coming soon. Well, as you can imagine, there's a lot of paintings related to this event, and I've pulled out a few of them. I got a few more than normal tonight, but I wanted to share some of these with you. Yeah, if you'd kill the lights a little bit. So this first one is from the 1800s, called The Morning of the Resurrection. And in this one, you just have the profile of a quiet Jesus, and there he is with the women and talking with them, talking to Mary Magdalene. She's got this expression of uncertainty on her face. She's not clear what's going on. In this picture, we don't see any soldiers. We don't see any angels. We just see Jesus with the women.
Was Jesus in that painting the whole time you had it on the screen there? Or did he suddenly appear? 'Cause I don't remember seeing him though at the beginning.
Pretty sure he was there.
All right.
The next one is called The Resurrection of Christ. This is by Rubens. Kind of has that Rubens trademark, real full-figured people that he draws. Muscular Jesus, solid Jesus, coming out of the cave, white fabric around him, carrying this pennant, which is red, again, a sign of the blood, sign of royalty, and just very nonchalantly coming out. The soldiers are scrambling in fear and distress. Earthbound. He's not. Some of the paintings we see him kind of floating in the air. Here he's very much on the earth. Well, then one more is. This is actually here locally. It's in Pasadena, the Norton Simon Museum. The Resurrection of Christ. We see a stern Christ here, again, coming out of a sarcophagus. They're painting from the time frame that they're in, right? So they're painting sarcophagus. They're painting people in period costumes as they portray this. There are a couple of guards sleeping. One is kind of startling, waking up. Kind of natural scene in the background. If you can look, let me see if I can magnify this. If you look way in the back from the hillside, there's some women. They're the women that are approaching the tomb.
It's a pretty miserable looking Jesus.
Yeah. This one, painted in the 1400s, again, we've got people in period costumes, we've got a sarcophagus. The thing I like about this one, of course, Jesus is clothed in red, but notice that he's sitting on top of the sarcophagus, and the top of that sarcophagus is undisturbed, right? It's closed. Whereas so often we see a stone rolled away, or we see the sarcophagus opened for Jesus. No, here, clearly, he didn't need to be open for Jesus to come out. And you see those red diamonds, those represent the seals on the sarcophagus. So it's still sealed, and here's Jesus outside of it. So I like that one for that reason. And one more. This is actually a tapestry that's in the Tapestry Museum, and it's only one part of the tapestry. I'll show you the bigger view in a minute. But here we see Jesus coming out triumphantly, and let me magnify this one part up here. Jesus is looking us right in the eye. He's looking right at us as he comes marching triumphantly out of the tomb. Again, clothed in red and carrying the sword.
Oh, it's a sword because it gets lost in there.
Okay. Now, this is actually just one section of a larger tapestry,
Wow.
which looks like that. So it covers this whole wall in the museum in the Vatican. So, different ways of people portraying the resurrection, different things they want to emphasize as they pull this out. All right, so let's wrap up here. What did we learn about God tonight in this passage?
His appointed times and everything is so set out. I mean, if you really read the Bible, if people really did, I just don't understand how they wouldn't believe it. Because all of these fulfillments, the prophecy, Leviticus 23, all of it leading up to Revelation, the whole thing is just incredible. It's unbelievable.
I think the fulfillment of when Christ was the Passover lamb, he was definitely the first fruit on that day. It's just amazing that God is so specific.
And even down to where he was born, Bethlehem, where they raised the spotless lambs for sacrifice and a house of bread. I mean, everything is just...
And how they looked at the spotless lamb and how they reviewed him, and how they questioned him with all the right questions.
And then Jesus became that.
Well, then, just in closing, just any general thoughts, what's striking to you about these simple words of Luke and talking about the resurrection?
Something so supposedly simple is something so huge beyond simplicity. It's just incredible.
Very profound for everything to hinge on whether that tomb is empty or not. And if it's not empty, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that's it. The whole Bible, everything, you just throw away all the millions of, I don't know if there's been a billion Bibles printed. I just think of how many Bibles there are, but if that tomb is not empty. All of them, just throw them all away with trash, and, this is pointless for anything. But that has not been the testimony of history. That does not seem to be, it's definitely not the testimony of the scriptures, of course, but history and how it's all panned out.
You wouldn't have a job, you would.
Yeah. And that's the best part. And I would be unemployed.
They could have the best thing for them.
That might be the only perk, but
Would that to have been to reduce the body, but of course they couldn't.
yeah.
That
It could have been undermined, the claim. That does not happen. You bring forth the body. There's any number of ways that
surprised they
you
didn't try to
Sure.
swap one in, but
Right. Well, this is before, modern, cinema tricks where you can make body doubles,
yeah.
AI and all that, so nothing. They had every reason to shut this down, especially when it got more popular, and just history did not record that happened. So what do you make of that? It's not like the church had all the power to manipulate the media and all that kind of thing. They were very much the minority and the underdogs. So the Jewish people, the Romans, they all had the authority to shut this down if they wanted to that way. But they had to resort to persecution, which tells you that the tomb was empty. If they had to resort to persecution and killing Christians to get them to shut up, that tells you the tomb was empty. So that's it then. That's it. Then it's now the whole thing is found. Everyone's culpable to it, and you have just the opposite. I have a job. So that's the proof.
God did that so you'd have a job.
One of many works.
There was one more thing about the timing that I meant to bring out and I forgot. If this had happened in a year when the Passover didn't fall on a Friday, if the Passover fell on a Monday, they probably would have just let those bodies hang on the cross for days, right? They were taken down because the Jews were, in their mind, obeying the law that the body shouldn't be hanging on the cross on the Sabbath. So if the Passover were on a Monday that year, they might have hung there all week.
But God saw that all of it happened as He had planned.
Right.
From the beginning
Right.
to everything.
Yeah.
It's just incredible.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
I think that if Luke or any of the other Gospels would have told us more, we would have made more of all of that. Imagine the movies, imagine all the stuff that they would have made in that. But the point that the angels say, He's not here, He's risen, that's all they needed to say. They didn't need to say how, what, when, where. They just said, the tomb is empty.
Yeah.
It's just, people say, oh, I've read the Bible, but they obviously haven't, because you couldn't, if you really set to do it, many people have and they believe when they see it. So,
We call them Christians, but, how close was it that we could have been called empty tumors?
the church would be empty too.
All right. Well,
Don't say that anywhere else.
well, thanks for some good discussion tonight. Let me pray and we'll be on our way.